Welcome to the Heartification Podcast, where I interview people on how art has affected their lives and what it means to them. Art has a very special place in my life. It not only makes me feel happy, but it allows me to make others feel special. This podcast is all about how art has made an impact on others' lives, for all ages, all backgrounds, and all walks of life. You can find more about this podcast guest in my show notes. Without further ado, let's welcome my next guest. He is a criminal profiler, forensic linguist, and author. He has written 3 books, A Journey to the Center of the Mind, and you can find out more about him on his website, jamesrfitzgerald.com, where you can also purchase his audiobook, The Fitz Files Manhunt Unabomber. Please welcome my next guest, James R. Fitzgerald.
Hi, Avni. Great to be on board with you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. So the first question I always ask is, how do you define art?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that for a few days now. I knew the topic of the podcast, of course, and art is expression. Art is putting on paper, on a wall, on a celluloid, on digital thoughts and feelings of who and what we are. Our earliest ancestors did it in caves. We're now doing it digitally on computers, and there's all other kinds of art in between. So it's an expression of who we are at a given time and a given place. Some may say a snapshot, but it captures the culture at the time, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with you. My definition is any form you're able to express yourself, let out your emotions, your feelings, kind of just let it all out. It's like your little friend where you can go to if you're feeling down, if you're feeling happy, whatever your emotions are, it's always there. And art has always been a part of our life. And as you said, the cavemen that, drew on the walls, that was art. And it's amazing to see how art has developed over the years now into digital art and AI and VR.
Absolutely. And it's now available to everyone. And where people perhaps only had, paintbrushes to use back in the day, or chalk, or even rocks to scrawl into a wall, now there are many, many ways of doing it. And the mind is the limit, which of course means there's really no limit. And I welcome all kinds of art. I'm not an expert in any of those, but I do appreciate art from its earliest forms to more modern forms. And of course the great artists over the years. So so it's a little part of my life, and I have a few interesting anecdotes that we can get into how at least one famous artist helped us sort of solve a major case, or at least solve a part of it. We can talk about that when you're ready.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. And what art forms are you exposed to?
Yeah, definitely artwork, the visual representation on paper, on canvas. I've taken in a few art shows over the years. I toured an art gallery this past weekend, but I'm certainly appreciative of sculpturing and art as a written form. Of course, we didn't really discuss that per se. I am the author of 3 books. They're nonfictions, which means, of course, they're what exactly happened. I've received compliments for my writing style, but I sometimes feel that I'm cheating because my stories come directly from my brain, that I'm relating things that happened to me, because it's my autobiography in 3 different books so far. I really admire novelists and fiction writers who can create something from whole cloth, although I've learned that they usually base it on something they may have experienced in their lives. So definitely, I'm never not reading a book. That's been since I was younger than you even. I've been reading books all the time, usually nonfiction, but every once in a while I'll read a novel or 2. And if they're well written, I'll certainly enjoy them. Movies and TV, somewhat. I'm not as interested quite as much anymore in those in that genre as I used to, but there are some classic ones out there. And I'm proud of, we can talk about this too. I helped design the covers for 2 of my books. I was not the artist who put pen to paper or color to, computer screen, but I was the one that gave the idea to an artist, now deceased, Stephen Jeter, and he really came out with some nice covers. I've received compliments on them too. So even though I'm not the kind of person who would actually sculpt something or paint something. I just don't have that skill set. I feel proud of myself that I gave some good ideas to a real artist, and he captured it very well on two of these book covers.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. And as you were saying before, how these fictional authors can create, a whole different world. And, I'm really into Harry Potter. And, I always read these like different things about Harry Potter. And as I was reading all these different things, I realized J.K. Rowling, she based a lot of the characters and the magical beasts on her own personal situations and her childhood, and like the Dementors. I don't know if people out there don't read Harry Potter, they're like these creatures that are soul sucking, but they're based on her depression that she had battled, and some of the characters are based on her childhood friends and stuff. So I think it's really cool that all these different fictional characters that we all relate to are also relating to her and what she experienced growing up and what her situations she was placed in.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned I'm a forensic linguist. Of course, we assess language. And even though I believe she invented most of these characters herself from her past, her childhood, there was at least one author out there who felt that she, at least to some degree, plagiarized off of her and borrowed some of her storylines, plot lines, characters, even creatures from something he wrote. I forget the name. It was like in the early 1980s. It turns out it went to court, and the court did not find in his favor. So the lawsuit was dismissed. Nothing came to it. But of course, she has sold probably billions of books at this point, and the movie series and what have you. So here someone saw a chance to at least try to get some money their own that way. But so even with someone like the author of the Harry Potter books, forensic linguistics, language played a role in that whole thing, and artwork in and of itself in some ways. And but to her credit, it turns out the case was dismissed and it had no merit.
Yeah, that's cool. And I haven't heard of that, but yeah, it's amazing what some people can just do for money.
Well, if you're successful out there, and I've learned this, there were people that'll take shots at you and try to either get money from you or diminish what it is you say or do, but that's okay. If you are a stand-up person, you've done everything honestly and above board, you have no fear.
Definitely, I agree. And how do you use creativity in what you do?
It depends on the daily basis of what it is I am doing. I just completed a audiobook called, and you're nice enough, Avni, to mention it, The Fitz Files, Manhunt Unabomber. And it's because I've received so many questions since the miniseries itself, Manhunt Unabomber, was released in 2017. Now it's still on Netflix. I finally said, I got to answer these questions in like my own audiobook. So I did 10 hours of interviews. I talk, of course, but I interview other people, the director, the head writer, set director, one of the co-creators of the show, set decorator, I should say. And we put this whole thing together. And I was surprised at some of the, I suppose, storytelling artistry that I kind of came up with along the way. And my producers complimented me on this, and now people who are listening to it. And I don't mean it's overboard or crazy in any sort of extravagant way, but I decided to sort of break it down in a format, where the first part is just telling the story of what really happened in the Unabomber case, what the miniseries showed, and then the second part is interviewing director, head writer. This is over 8 different episodes with a prologue and an epilogue, beginning and end. So, but I decided to bring in an Australian person to ask me the questions that the actor Sam Worthington had asked me early on. So because he just wasn't available to actually ask the questions, but I had email versions of them. So she read the questions in her Australian dialect. I answered them, of course, in my American English dialect, and it was a fun thing there. So I'm kind of proud how that all came together. I also helped design the cover for it, the logo, I should say, for the series, which is really based on my third book cover. And again, I received some compliments for that too. My good friend, Rick Schilling, is a artist in his own right, He's a musical composer, and he sent me. I'm said I need some music for my upcoming audiobook, and I'm sure you've listened to them or podcast. You have little music interludes, intros, outros. So I knew I needed that. So I hired him, and he sent me a few different versions of his compositions. And I said, maybe a little different one than this, maybe a better, heighten this feature or lower this feature. And we finally came to an agreement. So, and I think the music on there speaks for itself, including at the very end. I let it run for a whole minute while I'm sort of paying tributes to the victims of the Unabomber. And I was glad for everyone to hear the full minute composition. So I don't know if I necessarily use art every day in my life, but I think if you're composing a sort of complicated email or writing a report or I'm writing a book or putting together a podcast or an audiobook of my own, I am looking to my inner artist to be sure I can present myself in the most positive and edifying way to people, but not just listing facts and declarative sentences. I try to kind of paint a picture of what's going on, including hopefully the prep I did for our interview today. So there's artistry. I'm looking at a piece right now above my desk that has some significance to me. And again, it ties in with the Unabomber case, and we can talk about that when you're ready here.
Yeah, awesome. That's awesome. And can you tell me a little bit more about what is forensic linguistics?
Sure. Well, linguistics, first of all, is the scientific study of language. Scholars have been doing it for centuries. It goes back to the Greek philosophers, Socrates and Aristotle wrote about, how different language are around the world and even dialects within a language. And forensic in front of any science means sort of the court arguing or investigative aspects to it. From the Latin, forensics is arguing the truth or something like that. So forensic linguistics is using the science of language and applying it in a courtroom and or investigative setting, usually the opposite way around there. So that's what that is. And I cut my teeth in linguistics. I didn't even call it that then. In the mid 90s in the Unabomber case. And I realized I had a natural talent for assessing written language and some spoken language. But I realized if I wanted to get better at it, I better go back to school and get myself another degree. I already had a master's in organizational psychology, but I went back to school after the Unabomber case and attained my second master's in linguistics at Georgetown University, and I'm very glad I did. So, and to this day, even though I retired from the FBI 13 or so years ago, as a consultant, I'm still doing work on cases involving forensic linguistics and trying to help people solve, in most cases, who's writing an anonymous communication that's negative against me or my company or my brand, something like that. And I have had pretty good success over the years in finding out the exact person who wrote an email, a blog entry, a social media post, something like that, or an old-fashioned letter. And that my track record's pretty good in that way. And I'm glad to help people when I can in that regard.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool how you can detect who wrote it. I find that really cool and really interesting.
Well, it does. It does actually work, and there's science behind it. And my specialty is written language. Other people specialize in spoken language, but there's a lot to be told from even just a few paragraphs of someone. If it's kind of their natural writing, and they're not trying to mask or camouflage who they are, you can pick up on issues relating to gender, to age, to ethnicity, to race. To their writing abilities, sometimes their educational level, and you can really develop what we call a linguistic or demographic profile of that individual. And I've been doing that for about 25 years now. And again, it's worked very well for me.
Wow, that is so cool. And can you tell me about the role of forensic linguistics in catching the Unabomber?
Well, sure. And I guess this is a good time to bring art into how that worked. But pretty much art took a backseat in the beginning. We were looking at a series, first of all, Unabomber case, 1978, 1995, 16 different bombings by an unknown person. His name, the nickname was Unabomber, or Unabomb originally, and it was an acronym for University Airline Bombings, because his earliest victims were, in fact, college professors, college students, and airlines. So people can look this up, watch the miniseries, listening to the Fitz Files. But the case went on. I'm finally brought into it in 1995. A seasoned investigator at the time, but a brand new profiler, and I get out there and to San Francisco, where this 100-person task force was set up already, and they're saying, we got to catch this guy. He's still bombing. He's still killing. He sent his 35,000-word manifesto to the New York Times to get published, and if they published it, he would stop bombing people. So they got me involved, and I started focusing on the language because no other evidence was present in the case. No fingerprints, no DNA, no indented writing or anything like that. Hairs and fibers, nothing. So I focused on the writing, and we finally got it published because I was positive there was enough idiosyncratic writing features within this communication, this manifesto, and 13 earlier letters, that someone would recognize it. And it took a while. It took about 6 months for the FBI to finally be contacted. But after the September 19th of 95 publication of the manifesto in the Washington Post, as it turns out, we got a phone call from a lawyer and says, yeah, we got a guy. He thinks his brother is the Unabomber. Look at this 23-page document, which I did from the early 70s, compared it to the Unabomber's writings. And I said, you've got your man. And they brought me back. I was actually back in the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia then. They flew me back to San Francisco. And within about 7 weeks, we had Ted Kaczynski under arrest. But the interesting thing I want to throw here to you, because I've teased it a few times, I guess that's a little bit of art in and of itself, right? To do that correctly, is his manifesto was titled Industrial Society and Its Future by FC, just the 2 letters, FC. Nobody knew what that meant. He claimed in the New York Times letter that he wrote what it stood for, but we knew it wasn't his initials. We just weren't sure what it could possibly be. So, and on the bottom, by the way, of every one of his explosive devices, he etched in the letters FC. And again, what does FC mean to this guy? Nobody knew. We arrest him. There's nothing, and we go to this cabin in Montana. Remember, he was a former professor, Harvard graduate, PhD in mathematics, living in a cabin all by himself in the woods of Montana. This is the Unabomber, but we finally caught him. It's a team effort on the part of the FBI, but I was glad that it was my language analysis that really got us in the door of this guy. But now we had to build our case from there too. So we took all the documents out of there, whatever, and but there's still no clue as to what FC meant. We're getting a lot of other evidence from the cabin. But here, what was also happening the day he was arrested, April 3rd, 1996, 25 years ago last month, we also conducted a search on a home in suburban Chicago. It's the home where the Kaczynskis used to live and where Ted lived when he did his first 4 bombings. So the FBI thought that maybe they could find some bombing components in there. This would have been like 16, 17 years later, but maybe they could find some cut wires, battery pieces, whatever. Nothing like that was found, but they went behind, the owner, the new owner, pointed out a fake wall. They knew there was something hidden in there, but they never opened it up. So finally, the FBI, with the permission of the owner, opened it up. And what did they find inside but artwork? A very specific piece of art. And I'll say right up front, it's not an original, it's a copy. So there's no true value to this, but it was an art piece entitled At the Circus, Performing Horse and Monkey. Who was the artist? André de Toulouse-Lautrec. I'm sure you've heard of him. An impressionist French painter. I think he had a few other categories he fell into too, but from the early part of the last century. So 1890s, early 1900 France. And this was a copy of a picture of I'm looking at it right now, it's above my desk, so forgive me while I'm staring up, but it's a bulbous, fat, ugly looking clown with a whip in his right hand and there's a horse and a little monkey next to him. And if you've read the manifesto, the Unabomber was very much against big government, big business, big entertainment. He thought our society should live in tribes of 30 people and an agrarian tribes, like I said. So this picture was very emblematic, we thought, of the Unabomber and his philosophy. Again, this big fat clown, I'm looking at him again, mysterious. You can't even really see his face. He has a hat over his. You and your listeners can look up this piece of art and you'll know what I'm talking about. But it really would describe Kaczynski's philosophy about the clown being government, being society, and we are this poor horse and monkey getting hit with the whip. Again, his philosophy. I said, all right, that's interesting, but does it tell us anything else about him? Well, as you probably know, artists go through different periods, blue periods and others, depending on who is the artist and what have you. And they even sign their artwork differently. They'll left side of the portrait, right side, or the artwork, whatever. Well, Toulouse-Lautrec went through a stage where he signed his artwork. It looked like a circle with the letters FC inside of it. And I finally saw this. It was sent to me, the copy. Again, this was not an original piece of art. It had no value. It was I guess you call it a lithograph or a poster of it. And I finally looked at it, and I looked at the bottom right-hand corner where the artist's signature should be, and there it's a circle with FC. So I was convinced that all this mystery about FC on the bombs, FC who wrote the manifesto, we now know where it came from. At this point, almost 100-year-old piece of art from Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, the French impressionist. And we were going to present this at trial, perhaps even bring in an art expert to explain the meaning of this and an interpretation of the artwork itself. But eventually Kaczynski pleaded guilty. So you can go to my book, A Journey to the Center of the Mind, book 3, and I have a close-up of the portrait itself. And then I focus in on the little right-hand corner, and there it's very clear to see FC on it. You can also do it, I'm sure, online if you look it up and then blow it up. So believe it or not, the Unabomber, there was an art aspect to the Unabomber case. When we went through his documents in the cabin, he was mostly a writer, and he's a very good writer, actually, and he wrote some very interesting fictional stories that we read. I don't believe he had too many drawings, but I think he had a few sketchings. So even this serial bomber who killed 3 people, seriously injured 25 or so others, almost brought down a commercial airliner. Here he had an artistic side to him too. But of all the painters, of all the artists in the world, the one to whom he seemed to have the most connection, the most association, was this French impressionist from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that's Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec.
Wow, that's awesome. I love how you took me through how you solved the case. That's awesome. And it's amazing to see how everyone has an artistic side. I mean, if you look at this man as a criminal, but he also had this artistic side where he expressed himself in his writing and in the manifest as well.
Well, sure. And we just wished he didn't use his artistry to design improvised explosive devices and
obviously
send them in the mail to people or leave them places. If he would have just done his writings and his whatever else he would have done on his own, that would have been fine. But unfortunately, artists can be troubled sometimes in various ways. And perhaps them utilizing their art skills helps minimize or mitigate, some of the issues they're going through. But some, of course, just can't control themselves. And we know of some artists, of course, who have, hurt themselves over the years, maybe with drugs, alcohol, or in other ways. And not all, of course, far from it. But sometimes the most artistic of people arguably can be troubled at the same time. And that's what happens there. So, but yeah, I was glad to, this was kind of like an exclamation point to me when the entire Unabomber investigation was finally figuring out where FC came from. Now, he never admitted it, Kaczynski. I even offered to meet him in prison. He's in a solitary confinement, 23 hours a day for the rest of his life in Florence, Colorado. They call it the Supermax Penitentiary. And I said, hey, I come out and visit you. I wrote him a letter, and I'll even bring you a gift that was found in the wall of the house in suburban Chicago. And I thought maybe he'd appreciate a little mini poster. I had to get it approved by the warden to give it to him. But alas, he never responded to my letter. No surprise. He knows I put him behind bars for life, one of the people. And he probably wants something to do with me, even with a gift in hand.
Wow, that's awesome. It's an awesome story. And how is creativity and thinking outside of the box an important role of catching Ted?
Yeah, in any serial offender, any sort of serial set of crimes, could be serial bank robber, serial forger. I mean, anything like that, serial killer. If they're successful after 2 or 3 crimes, one definitely has to, I don't think we would call it, use artistry in the detective or the profiler room, but certainly it comes down to utilizing a creative response or coming up with a creative response to, in fact, identify the person and track perhaps what they're going to do next. It doesn't take too much skill. I remember in New York City when I was working bank robberies, some robbers, you could determine the exact day they're going to strike again because they were obviously drug users and addicted. And if they got $2,000 from a bank on Monday, you knew the price of heroin or meth in the streets, and you knew that would last him maybe 5 days. So he'd be striking again, if not Friday, certainly the following Monday, something like that. And you could put the stakeouts there. So a little bit of artistry, I suppose, in that, but also even setting up a tactical response to a bank robbery team of sorts. But there's also been cases I've worked in which the bad guy has written to companies saying they're going to insert some kind of razor blades or battery acid in fluids that are in products that are going to be sold. In the case, there was one company in which the person sent a perfectly wrapped bottle of, I probably shouldn't even get into this, but it's a toxic substance that could really hurt people if they opened it. And he wanted us to place an ad in a certain newspaper to respond to it. And this is back in the 90s. People don't really read newspapers too much anymore. But the point is, we had to come up with a creative way of attracting this guy, but also buying some time that we weren't ready to pay this exorbitant amount of money yet. But then he got artistic and said, well, here's the plan. I want you to put these diamonds on a raft, send it down the Mississippi River unoccupied, have a flashing strobe light on it. And I said, man, I probably didn't use the word artistic at the time, but looking back, this guy had a very creative, if not artistic, bent about him that he came up with this idea that would have a chance of working, because always the toughest part in a bad guy getting money in a kidnapping or extortion is actually picking up the money. But to put it on a raft and send it down the Mississippi with a flashing little strobe light on it, it may have been a good way to do that. So, yeah, I think creativity, a good investigator, a good profiler, even forensic linguist, you have to be a little bit creative. You have to be able to think outside that proverbial box and hopefully solve the crime. If fingerprints and DNA don't do it, then you almost have no choice but to resort to your own level of creativity to try to figure out what this bad guy is going to do next and hopefully stop him in the act or at least identify him and arrest him afterwards.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's really creative how he's like, so, just a handoff or something with the money he's, putting it in the river.
Well, yeah. And I mean, it's one thing to say, put it in an intersection, or of course, nowadays with Bitcoins and cyber currency and offshore, banks and stuff, there are other ways that people do these kinds of things. But back in the 90s and even earlier, if somebody actually wanted cash or this guy wanted diamonds, to his credit, he was kind of creative there. And we had to come up with a creative way of intercepting him and following things through in that regard. And I don't want to give too many secrets away, but there were some ships in the Mississippi. There was even a submersible type device we had access to. So to follow some things and see where they were going. but that case never quite came to pass. And to this day, that guy's still out there. So yeah, as creative as we were in that case, it didn't always, sometimes it just doesn't work.
Wow. Wow, that's really cool. I'd love to hear all these cool like stories. Like right now I'm watching an FBI kind of show with my mom called White Collar. I don't know if you heard of it. And it's like they have all these different cases each episode. So I find it really interesting that you're here telling me all these real cases that happened.
Well, check out my book, especially my third book. It's the first day at the FBI Academy, and going through that training, and then going to New York City and working a bunch of cases there. So if you're into true crime, and it's not real graphic stuff, I wrote it with younger people in mind too, but they're real cases where kind of bad things happen to some people. And in fact, there was a case of a woman who came to the FBI in her late 20s. And she claimed her father was a serial killer, and he's still alive. And that's chapter, I think, 16 of my third book. And we had to come up with some clever ways of she was estranged from her father. She hadn't seen him in like 20 years. And she told us some very nasty things that he did to her. And then she saw him doing some bad things to women. We'll leave it at that for here. But we had to come up with some creative ways of reintroducing her to him, having her wear a hidden microphone, which she agreed to do, and a tape recorder. And next thing you know, over the course of about a year and a half, we slowly built the case about this guy, including we were going to take him to a lake where we think he may have put some bodies. And she didn't want to drive. She was too nervous to drive and talk to this man that, quite frankly, she was afraid of. It's her biological father, but she was afraid of him. So we decided to get a stretch limo, and guess who was the chauffeur? Well, if you can't see me, I'm pointing to myself, and I was the pretend chauffeur, and I was proud of coming up with that idea. There's an FBI sort of undercover limo that was wired for sound. So we had the tape recorder in the trunk, and she had these long conversations with her father and got some pretty good information out of him. Then she burned out. And if you want to really read the story, obviously you can read the chapter in the book, but I'll just tell you one other part of it. She burned out at some point, says, Agent Fitzgerald, Jim, I can't deal with him anymore. I just can't. I need a break. I said, do me a favor. Write him one letter, use a computer, word processor. Don't use your own handwriting. You can scribble your signature at the bottom. Send it to me first, and I'll send it to him from New York City. Because even though she wasn't living in New York, she told him she was. So I mailed it from there. We had a post office box that he could mail back. So she was tired of writing him. Guess what I did? Using, I would say, some bit of artistry, if not creativity, I took over the role of writing as his daughter. So I did it with a computer, so there was no handwriting but I looked at the first letter she wrote, and I mimicked over about 6 or 8 more letters over the course of the winter, these letters to him. And it's kind of weird. I was, probably in my late 30s, early 40s, a man. And for the first time, I'm sort of impersonating a woman, not in dress or attire or things like that, but certainly in my language. And I was trying to mimic, things that she would say, things that she would do, but also get information out of him. So we went back with one more limo ride. We staged some other things at the scene. And if you want to hear the ending of it, you have to read the book. But I was always proud of myself how that case worked out. And actually, I had a profiler who was working with me. I was a regular special agent in New York at the time. I brought a profiler in out of Quantico to help me. And I really impressed him with what I was doing, mostly on my own, but I would run it by him first. And a few months later, some openings came up in Quantico, and he kind of called me and said, Jim, you ought to consider joining us. And I'm pretty sure you'd get in the door based on your background. So I applied, and I was promoted to supervisor and profiler after that case. So, and the rest in 12 weeks of training as being a new profiler. My first case is Unabomber. And well, you kind of know where that went, don't you?
Wow, that's awesome. Like I said, I love to hear these stories. It's so interesting to me.
Check out the Fitz files. You can hear them there. And check out something about Unabomber. and of course my 3 books, including my first book is just growing up as a kid in the 1960s and 70s in Philadelphia. And I try to write all my books for younger people to look at and read, not to get into law enforcement, or they don't have to do what I did, but just, hey, here's my track, here's my journey. That's why I called the book A Journey to the Center of the Mind, all 3 of them, books 1, 2, and 3. Book 4 is coming up at some point. And it's just about life examples and life events. Some things I did right, some things I didn't do right. And I've been complimented by others saying, hey, I really learned from your books, and I'm going to follow this dream of mine, or take this turn and get this degree or graduate degree, whatever. And whether they're law enforcement or banking or dentistry, whatever, or linguistics, I'm really glad to help people in that regard through my books, and at least one TED talk I did. So and coming on podcasts like this, you do have the record, by the way, of being the youngest podcast host who ever interviewed me. So, but your father interviewed me last week, so I figured we'll just keep it in the family for now. So good for you. You hold the record.
Thank you. Yeah, that's awesome. And you got a chance to see Ted Kaczynski's cabin, and you kind of already mentioned this. So did you see Ted as an artist in a weird way?
Ted as an artist in a weird way. It would be a weird way if it was. I'll tell you his, I certainly don't want to encourage anybody to follow, this school of artistry, but his explosive devices were actually, in their own little way, pieces of art, including the packages he wrapped them in. Because to ship an explosive device through the mail and have it not explode, except when your intended victim opens it, that takes some skill, that takes some talent, not in a good way. I'm not encouraging anything here
Don't do that.
Or complimenting him, but I'm just saying, I was in his cabin. I saw how he cataloged, or I should say categorized, different components of his devices, different elements of his research that he had undertaken to write his manifesto. And, in some loosely interpreted way, you could call him an artist in that regard. And again, I would have been fine with everything he wrote over the years, except, of course, for him undertaking the bombings as an ancillary series of events tying in with that. So it's unfortunate that he had to go that route. He has his own pathology and psychological issues with which he's contending, but it's a shame people had to die for him to think that's the only way he could get his thoughts or his ideas out, which was wrong there. But his cabin, there's some pictures on my website, jamesrfitzgerald.com. If you want to talk about artistry, let's take it to the next step. And that is, there are pictures on my website under the Fitz Files link, or tab, I should say, in which there's pictures of the real cabin. And then there's pictures side by side of the Hollywood recreation of the cabin for the series Manhunt Unabomber. And I'm telling you, Avni, they're perfect. And I walked inside. You're too young to have this situation, but to go back in life like 20 years, and you're barely even half that yet, but to go back there and to walk into this Hollywood cabin, meaning it was the recreation of the Unabomber's cabin. It was identical. And it's very rare in life, believe me, as you'll learn as you get older, to be able to go back and do something and feel in time and feel you are totally there. And I did with this reproduction. So speaking of artistry, in my Fitz Files audiobook, I interviewed the set decorator and others who really walked us through and set decorator and I feel bad now. I'm not thinking of the other title, but a related field and I guess artist, set decorator, art director. Thank you. And they have different jobs. They sound kind of the same, but they're different. But the painstaking work these gentlemen and their teams went through to recreate the cabin, the 1990s FBI offices. You don't remember the big computer screens and the fax machines that were 5 feet high off the floor. But these guys found them, their team did, and they really made everything look well. So we talked about the artistry of the Unabomber, maybe somewhat there and even in nefarious ways but certainly the people that recreated his cabin. And again, look at the pictures on my website or watch the series, and you'll just know how closely aligned they are. You'll see some real true artistic talent there. These guys are artists in their own right.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. And, yeah, I'm only 14, as you said. So just 6 more years till 20.
I could do the math.
Yeah. But yeah, that's amazing how they could recreate exactly, make you feel that you went back in time. That's amazing.
Absolutely.
Takes a lot of skill.
It does. And the cabin that was a little bit wider, they actually had 2 cabins, and you'll hear this on the audiobook, but they could like remove the wall at some point to put the cameras in. And they made it a little bit higher because Paul Bettany, who portrayed Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, he's actually about 6'3", where Kaczynski's about 5'10". So they had to make it a little bit bigger for him, but to make it look like it's all proportionate, whatever. So yeah, it's really clever what the Hollywood folks can do when they are tasked with putting together something like they did in this miniseries. It was really professionally done all the way around.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I see writing as an art. So do you feel you were able to express yourself when you were writing your books?
Yeah, I do. And I go out of my way. I read, I write, reread, re-edit it, et cetera. And sometimes you reach a point that it just has to, you just have to say, all right, this is the final product. But I'm proud of myself. And it's for some reason in my second book, which is entirely about my 11 years as a police officer in suburban Philadelphia, an officer, detective, sergeant. I brought in, it was a very tense few years in there. And I was proud of myself looking back at it in that it's not just me writing declarative sentences, like I say, but I brought in a number of movie references, including, some lines of script. I brought in a Bob Dylan song in which I included some of the lyrics from it, everyone getting full citations here. I referenced Star Wars a few times throughout. The movie The Great Escape from about World War II, escape from a prisoner of war camp. And it's all kind of just blended into this book in terms of what I was going through at any given time. So yeah, I think writing, I know writing is an art, and all of us can write very factual bullet point type statements, which sometimes are necessary and arguably could have a level of artistry about them. But to really make something compelling and have arcs from one part of a book to another, in my case, actually over several different books, I would argue some level of artistry is involved in that. To what degree on a scale of 1 to 10, others can determine that. And I didn't write it to be an artist, but I knew that telling a story is an art form, and a beginning, a middle, and end. And it, like I said, it just can't be all straight sentence. These are the facts, ma'am, and nothing more, nothing less. I tried to, in most scenes, describe the people involved, describe the environment. Was it a rainy day, cloudy? The inside of a room, its basic dimensions. And it sounds like I'm like an engineer here describing something, but I think the final product in the book comes out relatively descriptive in that regard. And again, I'm proud of them for what they represent. I've been told for years I've led an interesting life, and I would tell stories. You should put that in writing. Do you ever think of writing a book? And it started run one book, but by the time I was finished, a few hundred pages, I said, I better make this into 2 books, which then turned into 3 books. And now it will be 4 books. The last one will sort of end with my career, not my life. I still have plenty of years to go, but with other work I've done, even in retirement, including being interviewed by nice young people like you. And I'll tell some stories about that too.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's awesome. And art is about expressing yourself. So how is this important when you are collaborating with a team?
Well, it is important. Life and personal interactions, again, could arguably be considered an art form, and that you need to have certain skills and learned behaviors to get points across, or to hear other divergent points of view from people, and how one nods their head even without saying a word, facial tics, body English, and how they respond to someone when they're relating a series of facts or an idea, or perhaps their way of solving, we'll say, a criminal case in my field. So it's important how one listens, how one takes their notes, how one allows someone else the freedom to express what they want to say. And I was told a long time ago by my father as a young child, don't be afraid to listen to anyone's ideas. In fact, son, I openly encourage you, listen to everyone who has ideas about something. You don't have to accept them. You don't have to agree with them, but be willing to listen. And of course, along with that, there are two sides to every story. A lot of people today, even in the media, they only get media, stories in the media from one outlet, and to the ignorance of all others, or the not reading any others, and they just don't have the full story. So I think in a task force situation, in a group meeting where perhaps one is the supervisor or one is the leader, I think the development of listening skills is an art. The development of communication skills is an art. And of course, they have to blend together, interwoven like, to get points across to people. And just as importantly, to allow them to give their points and not feel at all stifled or in some way any sort of resistance up against them for what they have to say. I always liked hearing ideas from my officers when I was a police sergeant, but certainly as an FBI agent, as a supervisor, from my subordinates. We didn't always follow exactly what they said, but sometimes we did. Sometimes we put two ideas together and sort of combine them. And of course, I answered the people also, and I would give them stories and them, I say stories, but give them ideas and create sort of ideas about how, where this whole thing was going. And in more cases than not, it's been successful in my life.
Yeah, definitely. And, I like how you mentioned how you should listen to everyone's ideas. Many different people have been through different situations and past experience that will lead up to their creativity and their way of viewing a case, or, just viewing anything, whatever situation you're in. So I think it's important to listen to other people's ideas and what they're trying to say, even if you may not agree with it, just hear them out.
Absolutely. And shame on the person who doesn't. There are closed-minded people out there, and that's a shame. And in the long run, they lose out. So always be willing to listen, and you will not go wrong in life.
Yes, I definitely totally agree. And art can be therapeutic, and it can help people get through some difficult situations. So has art ever helped you through a difficult situation?
Well, I, like any human being, probably at 14, you've been through some difficult situations. A few times older than you, I have too. And I believe art has, in fact, helped me in that regard. I remember going through some tough times in the mid-'80s, and my former chief of police was a very interesting guy, and he was an art aficionado. And he was the first one that introduced me to the art world. And he let me know about an artist named Marc Chagall, who an early modernist, French, and he happened to have an exhibit in Philadelphia at the time where I grew up. And I went to this exhibit, and I was very enthused about what I saw. And then here Marc Chagall died in 1985, and I realized how the value of artwork goes up once an artist, of course, passes. So, and like I said, I remember very well getting away. I even took I think I took my older son at the time, who may have been 6. I'm not sure I took my younger son. And I went there, and I wanted to expose my son to the art world. And of course, it was a paid exhibit, the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It wasn't cheap to get into, but I just wanted to. And really, I remember going through some difficult times then, and it was like 4 hours just away from the real world for me, and the beautiful tapestries of Marc Chagall and his different periods that he went through in his artistry. And I was very impressed by that. Remember years later going through some things, and I went to a Dada exhibit in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure you know that's sort of the opposite of traditional art. It's pieces of artwork and items put together, sometimes in a sculpture form too. And I don't only go to art museums when I'm down or going through troubles. I don't want to create that impression. I just remember going through something at that time. It was right before I was about to retire from the FBI. I was just thinking of different fields, what I wanted to do in my retirement years. I know I wasn't just going to sit back and do nothing, but I remember this exhibit very well. And I wasn't familiar with Dada style art before then, but that exhibit, just gave me some ideas about, again, how you can take loose pieces of different factors or entities in life, put them together, and there is a whole object. And I'm thinking, look at these different pieces of my life, my youth, my middle age, and around there, even to this day, and say, you know what, I can put some of these components together, and this is what maybe I can do in my next part of my life. And here I am, 31 years in law enforcement, but my first one of my first jobs in retirement was working as a technical advisor on the very popular TV show Criminal Minds. And here I am working with actors, with writers, with showrunners, with directors, meeting them. I'm at the studio, sitting down, and they're artists in their own right. And here I am bringing my world into theirs because they want to mine me for everything they can get. And I'm retired at this point, and they actually hired me, and I was being paid for this. And it was a very interesting time in my life of blending my real world into now the artistic world and putting that together. And the series just ended a year ago, and it went on for 12, 13 seasons. And there's a few characters one character I helped create. Her name's Alex Blake. She was a forensic linguist, seasons 9 and 10, I believe. And but I also gave them some ideas for some script lines and plot lines, including one called Gabby, where the term light bug was used, which was actually borrowed from a real case. And people can watch that episode if they want and figure it out from there. So has it helped me in times when I was down? Yeah, but it's not the only reason I want to experience art or immerse myself in that world. But I found even writing can be therapeutic, if not cathartic. Writing my first 2 books were definitely cathartic, and if not therapeutic. And where art fits into that, I'm not exactly sure, but there were a lot of things I wanted to get off my chest for decades. And when I finally sat down about 6-7 years ago, started writing my first book, it was very healthy for me to do that. I probably didn't think, oh, great, I'm doing art to get these things off my chest from these many years ago. But since you asked me the question, Avni, actually, that's how it all played out. So good question. And I hope I kind of made sense of it in my response to you.
Yeah, awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. And as you were talking about, like, before, a few minutes ago, how different pieces of different things can be used to create an object. I saw this artist, I don't remember where, maybe it was on Instagram, but she uses like pieces of garbage, like used cigarettes and pieces of paper, and she like glues them to a canvas, and it makes this, I think she like made faces.
Oh.
And it was really amazing how creative people can get by, just using these scrap pieces of paper and different things you wouldn't want to use for art, and she made it into something beautiful.
Well, that's what artists do, isn't it? And the cavemen only had shale and coal and pieces of stone of some sort, and they knew enough to put colors in the designs of the woolly mammoth and the water buffalo and whatever else they were drawing on the sides of the walls. And an artist makes do with what he or she has, and then it becomes art, and that's the bottom line.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. And are you attracted to any particular artist?
Marc Chagall has always been one of my favorites. Toulouse-Lautrec because of the Unabomber. I've actually went to an exhibit of his and bought a book of his. So I do appreciate those, both French. I'm also, I like Norman Rockwell. He was a U.S. artist and very much like Americana, pictures and the Currier and Ives, also artistry of, snowy, sort of seasonal holiday thing. So my friend Stephen Jeter, who is now deceased, unfortunately died much too young, but I was very impressed with his artwork. And I know he's had a few displays of his, and he said he did book 2 and book 3 covers. I gave him the ideas. So that's my artistry to kind of relate to someone and I think explain well enough what I wanted across. And then he sent me versions of it. We had them, go back and forth a little bit. But for a modern day artist, I'm not sure if, at least by name, I'd be familiar with some of them. But there's really no bad artwork. There's some that can be offensive at times, and we don't have to get into them here. And it is art. I will acknowledge that. But it's just art. You don't have to like every form of art. You have to like every picture, every sculpture, whatever it may be. So it's just something I wouldn't want to see or do. And like I said, without getting into details, there's some graphic stuff out there and even some anti-religious stuff that just, I don't care what your religion is, but I don't think, artwork should really strive to put it down somehow. So, but other than that, I'm wide open and I enjoy anyone's artwork, cartoons. People are skilled at drawing those, sometimes political or editorial, otherwise just kind of commenting on our culture. So all good there. And if you're a good artist, then I will enjoy your work. It doesn't have to be something I would perhaps buy or put on my wall, but I just bought 2 original artwork pieces this past weekend of just some sunsetting over some marshes. They kind of match each other. So they're original, and I met the husband of the artist. She wasn't there herself at this gallery, but I liked them, and I said I want them, and so I bought them. They're now hanging in my house.
Yeah, that's amazing. And are you attracted to any particular art form?
No, I mean the classics. I enjoy the full color and the representation of the faces. I've been in Florence, Italy, and toured the gallery there, and I've seen Michael and the statue, the sculpture. I don't think there's any one form that I would ascribe to, say, no, that's my favorite. If it's quality work, it can be a piece of work that someone's giving away for free and I really like it and I want it, or it could be a multi-million-dollar piece that I probably wouldn't buy, but I would still enjoy looking at it just as much. So, early modernism with Chagall and some of the Impressionists with Lautrec and of course the Van Gogh and his work, sort of the masters, I guess, suppose they call them. So if it's Dada, which is opposite of all that, as people say. So if it's something that attracts me and I can look at and say, oh, that's interesting, then guess what? They've turned me into an art lover of their particular genre, whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's awesome. And my heartification project is all about giving back to the community. So how do you give back to the community?
Well, I donate to various causes and that I feel are important. What I find doing now with all my years in law enforcement, how I give back to the community is I belong to an association known as the VDOC Society. That's V as in Victor, IDOCQ Society. Vidocq was a French criminal, went to prison. He came out in the 1700s and he decided to turn good guy and help the police. They hired him. He became a detective and eventually became the first, became a chief of police of Paris. I believe it was Paris, but one of the larger cities in France. And he's considered the first true detective. So in Philadelphia, back in the 1980s, a group of people formed what's known as the VDOC Society. When I retired in 2007, shortly thereafter, I joined the VDOC Society, and it's an association where we meet once a month, and we bring in investigators from around the U.S. We've actually had some international guests too come in, and we do our best to solve crimes. We do our best to look at their crimes that haven't been solved in a number of years, and they present them to us, PowerPoint, and we work them in the room that day and over lunch at the Union League in Philadelphia, and then we'll work it after the fact too, even after they leave. And our members are several hundred strong. I'm a criminal profiler, a forensic linguist, but we have former district attorneys, we have pathologists, we have computer people, we have scientists, we have DNA experts, crime scene reconstruction experts. There was, speaking of artists, one of the founding members of the VDoc Society. Oh, I feel awful. Frank Beeman. He was a sculptor. He was a forensic sculpturer. And he would look at the remains of people, again, not too graphic here, but perhaps skeletal remains. And he would do his best, and the person's unidentified, and he would do his best to create a sculpture of the face, including hair, and if it's a woman, maybe some lipstick or something on, and to do the best representation of what he thought this person would look like in real life, looking at bone structure, eyes, perhaps some of the clothing the person may have been found wearing. And it's amazing over the years when people were eventually identified, missing people or bodies that were found, and they put the real pictures up next to his sculpture. The matches were very, very close, including one that was just resolved about 2 or 3 months ago in my old police department of Bensalem, Pennsylvania. So I'm proud to be a member of that VDoc Society. To me, that's how I give back. Again, I contribute to charities. I do pro bono work as a forensic linguist or profiler. I'm active with a few different schools, Penn State, where I graduated with my undergrad. I've done a TED Talk for them. So in every way I can, I come on podcasts of young people like you, and even people that I know it may not get a whole big distribution or number of downloads, but I want to help them out and teach them a little bit about what I do in life if I can. But you do hold the record at 14, so you're still there. And I think the next one was at least 20 before you. So yeah, that's how I try to give back. I'm not a philanthropist or I don't spend all day doing altruistic type things, but I believe in most weeks I'm giving something back, including a lot of students who reach out for me, who want to be profilers, who want to be forensic linguists, and I'll answer their emails. I'll send them some literature that I have, some emails that I've saved that other people have sent me, and try to help out in that way. So that's the best I can do. And if I can guide any young people, and I always tell them too, and I'll tell this to you, Avni, pay it forward. And you're a young person. Through your father, you asked me to do this, so I did. So when you're up around my age, we'll just say over 40, there may be some young person that comes to you and has a request to make. Give her or him a helping hand and be willing to spend some of your time and give it back. And I try to always pass that word to people too. And by the way, when I do these true crime shows and even my audio book, part of that too, it's about the victims. It's about the people that suffered and even living family members of deceased victims. And I always try to, at the same time, teach people how to avoid being a victim of a criminal. And that's also something in my own little way I try to give back. We're not really doing that today in this talk, but in other sort of more serious true crime type scenarios, I always try to blend in. So if you're ever walking down the street and this happens to you, well, do this, do that, don't do that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how would you like people to get in touch with you?
The best way is through my website, jamesrfitzgerald.com. An email address is listed there, other ways to contact me. So that's the best way. I try to be responsive to most people if they're serious questions. They want signed copies of books or posters, things like that. So my website, jamesrfitzgerald.com, is the best way to do it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this.
You are absolutely welcome. And maybe every 7 years we can do this. So contact me when you're 20 and whatever the podcast is you're doing that. I'm kidding. But now you have a great future. Follow your dream, whatever it is. And I'm sure you will achieve it. Your dad's a great podcast interviewer. Seems like he really knows what he's talking about. And I saw your little sister crawl behind the floor when he was interviewing me last week. I wasn't sure if that was you or him. He assured me it was your younger sister. You wouldn't crawl on the floor, of course. So now this was fun. Thanks for doing this. If you could perhaps send me the link when you're done.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Remember, if you want to find out more about this guest, please go to my show notes where I have all the links needed. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to my podcast series and help me by sharing it, leaving a rating, and a comment. I hope you join me on my next podcast. Bye for now.